Next, we have Painting the Human and the Divine, the Virgin Mary in African Literature and Art. And for that presentation, we have Jenica Brown. She is a PhD student in the Department of Art and Archaeology at Princeton University. She studies late medieval and early modern Ethiopian art within broader cultural and geographic networks, with particular emphasis on the Mediterranean world. Her research focuses primarily on paintings, from the monumental to the miniature, and textiles, including histories of costume and the depiction of textiles in other media. Jenica received her BA in art history and Italian and her BFA in painting from Indiana University before completing her MA in art history at the University of Toronto. She is interested in strategies for presenting art, historical and social narratives to the public within museum context, and has interned at several museums, including the Sydney and Lois Eskenazi Museum of Art at Indiana University and the Indianapolis Museum of Art. In 2024, she participated in the Alex Gregory Tutorial Practice Program. Welcome, Jenica.
Yes. Wendy, how's the camera view? All good?
Oh,
can't see it.
yeah, maybe you want to make it a little bit bigger, just not in the, there you go. Not right. There.
All right. Morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today. Thank you, Wendy, to talk to you today about the miracles of Mary manuscripts from an art historical perspective. And I'm hoping that this overview will help you feel equipped to understand these paintings in sort of a broader Ethiopian artistic context, and also to explore this rich visual system with your students in the classroom. I myself am coming to this from an art historical background. I don't have any experience as an educator, I should say. So as well, I also know that we have different levels of familiarity with art history in general, with the Ethiopian and Eritrean traditions in particular. Some of you might even know more about it than I do. So I'll just try to be as clear as possible, and I'm looking forward to all of your thoughts and ideas. Now, one other thing I should clarify before I start is kind of the geography and terminology. So this artistic tradition pertains specifically to the Ge'ez manuscripts, of course, that we've been learning about. And so it was fostered in the region of today, what is both Ethiopia and Eritrea, especially in highland plateaus. And since the kingdom historically was called Ethiopia, I mostly use that name throughout my presentation, but I just want to acknowledge that this is also, of course, part of the heritage of contemporary Eritreans. So we've heard a little bit about how Christianity was introduced to Ethiopia's political predecessor, the Empire of Aksum, in the 4th century, which makes it the second oldest Christian nation in the world after Armenia. And for much of its history following this pivotal shift, most of the visual art produced in the Kingdom of Ethiopia, excluding practical crafts like baskervy, textiles, and so on, expressed Christian messages. Aside from this, there were also the practitioners of traditional religions, as well as Muslim communities and Jewish communities, who they were producing arts of their own, but I'm going to focus on the Christian topics today. So the three major art forms that were practiced in Christianity include painting, metalwork, especially processional crosses, and architecture. These are all interrelated, but again, in the interest of time, focusing on painting for today. Now, there's kind of a major issue in the field of Ethiopian art history as a discipline. Wendy knows about this. It developed directly out of Italian colonialism, and partly because of this, partly just because of general biases in the field of art history. The scholarship is heavily Eurocentric, and many scholars have described Ethiopian art as being derivative, extremely and heavily influenced by foreign, especially European sources. And that perspective is one that, of course, does a huge disservice to this rich tradition. So I always try to frame my own presentations around the perspective of what Ethiopian artists were doing in their own right, how this art functioned in its own proper context. And when I was planning this talk, this is the direction I was going in. Then I started to rethink that a little bit too late. I know that if you dig into the scholarship at all, you'll encounter these issues. So maybe I should have said about a bit more, but we can definitely talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. There are several different forms of painting that we can think about, including manuscript illustration, murals, and paintings on panel. The oldest surviving manuscript paintings from Ethiopia are from between the 4th and 7th century from the Garima Gospels that Jeremy mentioned in his presentation. And then there's kind of a gap in the record, which picks up in the late 13th century. There may well have been illustrated manuscripts being produced, they just don't survive. And the most commonly illustrated medieval texts are gospel books and psalters. There are just a few examples from the 14th and 15th century. There were a great variety of manuscripts that were being produced, but they have some common features that help us to define medieval Ethiopian painting from a stylistic perspective. So we can see that the human figures are abstracted, they have exaggerated facial features, their proportions are variable, the eyes are usually enlarged. The images are also decorated with geometric patterns, and background features, things like architecture, plant life, are relatively scarce. There's also a restricted color palette. It consists mostly of red, yellow, blue, and green in various shades, sometimes with brown as well as black and white. Overall, we can say that these images emphasize the spiritual significance of their subject, and they lean away from illusionistic realism. These are all features that are continued in later eras, although particular styles do change and develop, as we'll see. Another important type of painting in the Ethiopian tradition is that of church wall paintings. Figurative and biblical scenes were and remain popular adornment for church interiors. And church painting consists of biblical narratives and holy figures in complex arrangements loaded with symbolism. These often actually refer to the rituals as well as the physical organization of religious services that take place within the church. Here again, just two examples, one very early one from the 13th century, and then an 18th century example as well. Finally, painted icons on wood are also characteristic of the Ethiopian tradition. The practice of painting sacred figures on panels and using them for veneration and for devotion has a long history in the Christian world and was especially developed among Orthodox communities. As conduits for the presence and the power of the person depicted, icons not only inspired devotion, but were often believed to confer healing and other miracles on the devout. Icons and their related practices were widespread in the Greek Orthodox world by the 9th century. However, as far as we can tell, icon painting did not catch on in Ethiopia until the 15th century, when it was directly attached to the growing importance of the Virgin Mary during the same period. Emperor Dawit sponsored the first translation of the Miracles of Mary from Arabic into Ge'ez at the turn of the 15th century, and this collection included stories from elsewhere in the Christian world that involved an icon of Mary as a source of her miraculous intervention. These stories may well have inspired Dawit's son, Emperor Zada Yaakov, when he institutionalized the veneration of Mary by making it obligatory for every church to own and display a portable painting of the Virgin, as well as to regularly read her miracle stories during services. So obviously this new rule meant that artists started to produce these Marian icons in unprecedented numbers. And soon enough, miraculous icons started to appear in the indigenous Ethiopian miracle stories that were then added to the miracle collection. Just to clarify, I should add that the mother and child icon is the most popular type from Ethiopia by far, often paired with an icon of St. George, as we can see here. St. George, coming dragon. But there are also Ethiopian icons depicting God, angels, various saints, both local and from abroad. They also vary in size according to their use. So for example, a large icon would be suitable for display in public, in a church, or during a religious procession, while there are also much smaller ones used for private devotions or worn around the neck. Turning to manuscript paintings, I'd like to say a little bit about how they're made. Tomorrow and Friday, we're going to hear from a practicing artist and get some hands-on experience. So I'm really looking forward to that. Not least because, just from a scholarly perspective, it's really useful to be able to compare kind of the historical evidence of the objects themselves and then the tradition as it's been carried on in practice today. So as we've heard from Jeremy, Ethiopian manuscripts were and continue to be created primarily by clergy of the church. And in the medieval period, monasteries were vibrant centers of manuscript production, often quite wealthy ones. The scribes and the artists were probably not usually the same person, but instead they would collaborate. And normally the scribe would have written out the text, leaving a space for the artist to fill in afterwards. Now, especially in the monastic context, this act of creating art for devotional use was viewed as itself a devotional act, and it formed a part of the monk's sanctified lifestyle. And as for how the artists were taught, I think of it similarly to how scribes were and are taught. They probably had kind of an apprenticeship system. A young artist would learn by working directly with another artist and copying manuscript models. There may also have been workshops or more formal schools with multiple practitioners working together. And sometimes we can tell just from looking at different works in the same manuscript that multiple artists did contribute. However, we don't have, specific records about this. We're just looking at the manuscripts, at what's going on today, and at other similar kind of cultural contexts elsewhere in the world to make an educated guess. We can analyze the steps in traditional Ethiopian manuscript illumination using works that were unfinished, as we see here. So new paintings were often copied from earlier manuscripts, and we see the same kind of basic compositions being repeated over and over, although artists exercise their creativity to kind of move figures around, change details, do things like that. So to begin a picture, the artist would start with a charcoal sketch. This allowed them to kind of work out the composition in a medium which is very easy to smudge away and make corrections. Then they would go over the charcoal lines in black ink once they were satisfied, and when that had dried, erase the remaining charcoal. Next, of course, came color. Ethiopian artists painted directly onto the parchment. And the main colors found in Ethiopian manuscripts, as I said before, are red, yellow, green, and blue mixed into various shades. Mostly these came from local mineral and plant-based pigments. Blue is a very kind of rare color. It comes from only a few natural sources, so that was usually imported. This should not be taken to mean that the color palette is limited just because there were a few colors available. For one thing, Ethiopia throughout its history had a lot of trade connections that definitely could have imported more pigments if there was interest. And for another thing, it's pretty much possible to mix any version of any color from the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, as well as white and black. And then finally, the palette does shift over time while remaining recognizable, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So in order to make paint, pigments have to be mixed into a binder. This is just something that holds them together. It creates, the liquid out of the powdered pigment. And in general, natural paints can be mixed with a number of things: oil, water, common ones, egg, and glue as well, or some combination. For Ethiopian artists, they were using just glue. This would have been derived from animal skin and bone, and it creates this kind of very bright and matte effect. You'll see from the photos, but as well when we look at manuscripts in person, these colors really retain their bright quality, even very old images a lot of the time. One other thing to note is about gilding, which was very popular in the European manuscript tradition, as you may know. It never really caught on in Ethiopia, despite the fact that they certainly had plenty of gold available locally. There are a few examples. This one here is, both of these images come from one of the earliest Mario manuscripts created for Emperor Dawit. So they did know about the technique, but usually they use just a bright yellow pigment. You can even see it here for the halo of a sort of lesser figure compared to Mary and Christ. This is yellow orpiment. It is a very gold and vivid yellow. And as I mentioned earlier during Jeremy's Q&A, most Ethiopian artists didn't sign their work, so we don't know who they were most of the time. And this is probably because their role as an individual artist was viewed as being sort of subordinate to the divine purpose to which the works were dedicated. And this is also generally true in medieval Europe and the Byzantine Empire. There are just a few exceptions where the Ethiopian artist did add a signature, and this is often accompanied by a prayer request for prayer from a later reader. All of these known artists were men, as was the case with the scribes. There haven't really been any serious studies that I know of regarding the possibility of women artists in pre-modern Ethiopia, but it probably would have been unusual. Often the manuscripts and other devotional artworks as well were commissioned or sponsored by members of the nobility or perhaps wealthy lay persons. This was an act of piety on the patron's part and could also strengthen a political relationship with a significant monastery. Sometimes portraits of the patrons, whether of a specific work or of a religious institution more generally, are included in religious painting as a further expression of their devotion and as a reminder for later viewers of the work to pray for their salvation. So an early example, again, is this Miracles of Mary. We see Emperor Dawit no fewer than 10 times throughout the manuscript, always kneeling before Mary. These patron or donor portraits became increasingly popular after the 16th century. And the patrons do appear in a number of poses, but the most common one, as we see in these two, is where they're lying in front of the saint or divinity in the painting. So if you see a figure in this pose, most of the time, that's what that represents. As you can also probably tell, these aren't portraits in the sense of being like an accurate likeness of a specific person. They're more generic and generally only identifiable if named in an inscription, although the social status of the person might be indicated by their costumes, such as these figures wearing, very ornate, rich costumes, obviously aristocrats of some kind. So as we know, the Mother of Christ has an extremely important role in the theology of the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches, and she is the most popular figure in the art of these cultures, not just in the Ta'ameret Mariam, but in other formats as well. Whether in manuscripts, in wall paintings, or in panel paintings, we can categorize images of Mary into two types. These are also valid for Marian imagery from other cultures. So the narrative type illustrates a specific story. This could be a story from Mary's lifetime, such as her childhood or the birth of Christ, or of course, one of the miracle stories that take place mostly after the end of her life on earth. There are conventions for how these stories are portrayed, and by virtue of their religious nature, they express eternal truths, but there can also be multiple acceptable ways for portraying the same story. And of course, there are just an astonishing variety of stories themselves, which we'll talk more about in a moment. The second type, so these three here are all examples, moving in from the left, of narrative images. So Mary being presented to the temple as a child, the Nativity, and Mary at the crucifixion of Christ. Then the second type is what I call iconic, and I mean that kind of in two senses, both because it's closely associated with actual painted icons of Mary, and also because it is kind of the prototypical representation of her. So rather than representing a specific story, a specific moment, it's really representing her essential eternal role. And the iconic representation of Mary is the Madonna and Child, or as it is usually labeled in Ge'ez, Our Lady Mary and her beloved Son. Ethiopian iconic images of Mary and Child almost always include the two archangels, Gabriel and Michael, as we see here, flanking the central figures. And in this posture, they function as the attendants who would have accompanied a woman of noble status in Ethiopian society. With their outstretched wings, they also invoke both the cherubs on the biblical Ark of the Covenant and the canopies that were placed over icons in churches, according to Emperor Yakov's rules. The earliest illustrated manuscripts of Miracles of Mary did include both iconic and narrative images, but the narrative scenes were all from her life on earth, rather than the posthumous miracles. The images thus express who Mary is, how she became Christ's mother, what she experienced during his life and death. These are all extremely important aspects of her identity, of course, from a theological perspective, but do not relate specifically to the miracle stories. And there's just one known example of a Ta'ameret Mariam with illustrated miracles that was created before the 17th century, in this case, the early 16th century, from a manuscript held at Baba Mariam. And this is an unusual manuscript in several ways, other than the subject and the early date of the illustrations. They're also very unusual stylistically. You can see that they're basically line drawings with light washes of color, which we don't really see elsewhere in the Ethiopian artistic tradition. And based on the style of the drawings as well, we can tell that it was probably made by one of the handful of Western artists that were employed in the court at this time. Now, this hasn't really been seen, as far as I know, or published since the 1970s, so not that much is known about it. However, it's debatable whether later artists took any inspiration at all from this manuscript, since the style and motifs are pretty much different from what we see later on. And it wouldn't be for another century that the illustrated miracle tradition really took off with the original iconography that we see now. So the 17th century was a particularly energetic one in terms of artistic innovation in Ethiopia, following multiple decades of war and conflict. In the mid-16th century, the Christian kingdom had been invaded by the Muslim Sultanate of Adal, a former vassal state located in the south of today's Ethiopia and Eritrea. This war lasted multiple decades and was devastating for the Christian kingdom, including the destruction of many monasteries, churches, and their collections of religious artwork. Eventually, the Adalites were defeated with the help of Ethiopia's Portuguese allies. The Portuguese, who were engaged in expanding their empire and their trading connections into Africa and the Indian subcontinent at this time, had established diplomatic connections with Ethiopia already. And after the war, many of the Portuguese soldiers settled in Ethiopia and started to integrate. However, this encouraged Jesuit missionaries to enter the scene and began an effort to convert the Ethiopian Orthodox Christians to Catholicism. And they actually did manage to convince Emperor Susenyos in the early 17th century, but the attempt to impose Catholicism on the kingdom and the population was met with stiff resistance and eventually a civil war. The Portuguese were expelled from the country, Susenyos was forced to abdicate, and his son Fasilides took the throne, restoring orthodoxy. Now, one of the noteworthy acts of Fasilides' reign was establishing Ethiopia's first urban capital in hundreds of years. Previously, the emperors had maintained a mobile capital that ranged between their monasteries and fortresses and across the realm in an enormous royal camp. At Gondar, however, Fasilides and his heirs built castles and encouraged the settlement of artisan and mercantile communities. So it was in and for the court at Gondar that many of the finest Metamarium manuscripts were made, and as early as the reign of Fasilides, artists began to add illustrations to the miracles themselves. Now, it's kind of an interesting question why they started to do this at this time, or why patrons started to ask for these pictures, perhaps, when before that apparently hadn't been an interest. There are a couple of purposes that this new image cycle might have fulfilled. One is that they add value to the manuscripts. Adding paintings to a manuscript always adds value and increases their prestige. Painting is a specialized and time-consuming skill. The colored inks can be more expensive, just like today in publication, or if you're buying a book, of course, it's more expensive in color. And parchment also was quite costly. So if you're adding illuminations, you're taking up kind of, extra space that could have been used for the text itself. So it's definitely possible that during this kind of period of renewal that I've mentioned, that the desire to create luxury objects inspired patrons and artists to turn to this huge body of material previously untapped of the miracle stories themselves and to create this new illustrated program that offered significantly more possibilities to add to the images of Mary and child or her life stories that we've seen in the earlier manuscripts. Another factor to consider is that of literacy. In Ethiopia, as in pre-modern societies generally, literacy was relatively low, and a lot of people would not have known how to read, especially not in Ge'ez, which by that time was no longer a spoken language outside of church and legal contexts. So even though the Metamarium stories were written down and read during the liturgy in Ge'ez, they presumably would have been, explained and retold orally in vernacular languages, but the pictures could be used to explain the stories and to recall them to listeners' minds, even if they couldn't read the text. So in that sense, pictures help to bridge this gap between a written tradition and an oral one. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the images also serve a devotional purpose. Anyone with access to the manuscript, whether they could read or not, could use the images as a tool for contemplation, to remember the stories they depict and the higher truths about Mary's power and intercession that they express. So as we've heard from Dr. Belcher yesterday, the Metamarium manuscripts are extremely variable when it comes to which stories are included. Nonetheless, when it comes to illustrated manuscripts, there are a few structural features that are common enough that they're worth thinking about and using as kind of guideposts. So many of the most heavily illustrated examples do still start with the narrative scenes from Mary's life, like the earlier manuscripts. And additionally, some also include an image and narrative cycle called the Kadana Mephet, or Pact of Mercy. And this represents the essential moment before Mary's death in which Christ promises her that anyone who prays or does the smallest good deed in her name will be saved, even someone as atrocious as a man who devoured 78 people. This pact, of course, sets the stage for many of the miracles to come and establishes Mary's key intercessory role. And this type of pact also features in the life stories of many Ethiopian saints. In Mary's case, in addition to the precise moment of the pact, which we see here, this is Christ, blessing Mary. There are a few other scenes from this broader story that are often illustrated as well. So let's see. We have the prophets in heaven kneeling before Mary, Mary looking into hell to see the damned, and Mary praying for the damned. Following the pact of mercy and scenes from Mary's life, these are included, we find the posthumous miracles. The paintings can be placed at either the beginning or the end of the story that they illustrate, and about 100 stories in all have been illustrated as cataloged on the PEMM website. The most commonly illustrated set of stories consists of 33. They have the name Akonubesi, which means was he not a man, and it's just the first line of a hymn that references each of the miracles. They're typically introduced with the story of the Bishop Eudoxus, also known as Hildefonsus, the 7th century bishop of Toledo in Spain, who is traditionally credited with writing down the first copy of the miracles of Mary. So the Akonubesi includes some of the oldest miracle stories to have been translated into GE'ez, as well as the earliest to have been illustrated. And this first illustrated version probably was created for the Emperor Fasilides or in his court. So all of these factors are probably why it continues to be popular and it's reproduced a lot. Because of that, there are certain standard ways of visually depicting the miracle stories that we can trace throughout time. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about different styles that we can think about. Many of the illustrated manuscripts were produced for the Gondarian court during the 17th and 18th centuries. So the two major artistic schools of this period are known as the first and second Gondarian schools or styles. This oversimplifies things. Certainly there were, other styles. There were kind of transitional moments between these two. There were artists working outside of Gondar doing their own thing, but especially looking at the miracles, this is like a useful starting point. So this is the first Gondarian style, and it covers roughly the 17th century. It can be recognized in a couple of ways. The colors are very clear and bright, as we can see. A lot of orange and blue are being used. In comparison, especially to what follows it, figures and faces are more elongated, and faces have an angular quality as they're shaded in with kind of a flat red schematic shading rather than molded light and shadow. Another notable feature is the exaggeration of fabric folds, which creates a strong decorative element of narrow stripes, and other small geometric patterns are used other places like the architecture and some garments. The paintings often take up the entire page and are set against the raw parchment without a background color. The second Gondarian style took over in the 18th century, and it does feature molded light and shadow, as we can see, instead of the flat red shading. The faces and bodies are rounded, and there is a lot of rich dark jewel tones throughout the paintings. Especially in the mid-18th century, there's a real profusion of floral patterns rather than geometric patterns. These are evoking Indian textiles that were imported into Ethiopia as luxury items. The overall impression, as we can see, is softer and more fluid compared to the strong geometric aspect of the first Gondarian period. And also, they've started to add background colors and enclose the pictures inside of rectangular frames. And there was the 19th and 20th century, which these styles don't really have names and have been somewhat neglected by scholarship. But we can see that some of the elements of the second Gondarian style remained popular. However, the figures are typically a little bit more elongated, and the colors are brighter, especially once new and synthetic pigments start to be introduced. There are also other manuscripts, like this example here, that are using a more geometric style, and it suggests the artists were looking at much older medieval works for inspiration. Yeah, I wanted to make a couple of comments about skin tones. That was so interesting to everyone yesterday and is a problem that comes up when students look at this art. So I've pulled two manuscripts from the 14th and very early 15th century that represent really the full range of skin tones that we find in Ethiopian art, from very dark to pretty much almost literally white. And again, this isn't a topic that scholars have spent a lot of time on. I will say that I haven't noticed any marked trend for fewer or more darker figures in any particular time period. It seems that there's just a smattering of them throughout, but that's a cursory observation. It definitely might not be accurate. And while there is a lot of variety of skin tones throughout the centuries, the majority of figures might be called light-skinned from kind of a modern Western perspective. So I don't know why this is. I just have a few thoughts. Obviously, one answer might be some kind of racism or colorism at play. I don't think that can be discounted. Personally, I'm kind of hesitant to assign that colorism, if that's what it is, directly to colonialism without direct evidence, because we do see these trends before colonialism was an issue. Even scenes, for example, where only servants and laborers are markedly dark. But we also see things like this, where all of the holy figures are very dark as well. I mean, I think one factor to consider is just the prevalence of colorism in most agricultural societies where, you know, exposure to sun is associated directly with manual labor. So something like that could be at play, but this is also a region with a very complex ethnic history. And so it's probably unwise to assume that these kinds of skin color variations meant the same thing to all artists or all viewers. Another explanation has to do with the history of Christian art, since the traditional iconography of God, Mary, and the saints has roots in the Greco-Roman world, where they were often depicted as pale in comparison to Ethiopians. And as these early depictions found their way to Ethiopia, some artists may have perceived them simply as the correct way to depict sacred figures. Perhaps they had a historically conscious recognition that Mary, Jesus, and the saints from the Levant may have been paler than they were themselves, or the pale color might have gained holy connotations separate from any kind of racial consciousness, or something else again that I haven't thought of. It is important to remember that, you know, we've been culturally trained to see skin color as one of the most important signifiers of racial identity, but that hasn't necessarily always been the case. And I loved Dr. Belcher's comments yesterday about some of the features of the paintings, especially ones in this like second Gondorian style that really speak to a specifically Ethiopian aesthetic and beauty standards, with things like the large eyes, the shiny skin, the feminine neck creases. So even when the figures do read to us as pale, I think it would be incorrect to interpret them as white or European. And just one last comment, I don't think that the skin tone choice has anything to do with available pigments. It's not hard to mix different shades of brown. Those are quite easy to find and make. And we do see throughout there, as this slide shows, some artists were happy to paint dark-skinned figures. Returning to the miracle stories. When artists began to illustrate these new narratives, they had to think creatively to depict all of the diverse scenes and stories that are represented, while still using conventions that would let the paintings be legible and widely understood for their viewers. So there are a number of common visual strategies that can help us to understand what we're looking at. First, many of the scenes employ what is called a synoptic narrative. This means that several sequential moments from the story are all being depicted within the same time frame, helping to kind of visualize the flow of the narrative. The overall effect, I think, is comparable to maybe a comic book, a graphic novel, something like that. So this example is the story of a woman with a broken leg who was unable to afford medical care. Instead, her family brings her into a church and leaves her lying in front of Mary's icon. That night, Mary comes to the church in the form of an apparition, waves her foot over the woman, healing her. So in the synoptic composition, we can see here from left to right, the woman as she's being carried in. This is the icon of Mary. Here's Mary, the woman lying down, and then Mary, the apparition, comes in and waves her foot over her. And the final scene here is Mary blessing the woman and the church warden who has come in to witness these events. There are a couple of visual hints that we can look for to distinguish different scenes. One is that each vignette is often framed by figures looking at each other. So for example, here, the figures move in from the left, and here Mary is facing back towards them, towards the right. Again, with these two figures, it's a little confusing with the way the final scene is sort of piled in there, but we can still see this pairing of figures looking at each other, this pairing of figures looking at each other. One thing to look out for is that artists sometimes change the appearance of the character or the way they're dressed from scene to scene. In some cases, even something like their hair color will change from black to gray. It's not always clear whether this is like a specific symbolic choice or maybe just the artist's kind of whim in that moment. Just as we can see here, there's kind of changing patterns in the way the woman is dressed. And then in her final appearance, she's got a different costume or has wrapped her shawl as a skirt instead. Mary's appearance does remain quite consistent, which is helpful. Even in different manuscripts, she's almost always shown in a red gown and a blue robe, sometimes with halo, sometimes not. Some other important features about Mary to notice include that she's sometimes depicted enthroned or seated on a stool, as we can see here, and holding Jesus in her arms. Sometimes she's shown standing with or without Jesus, as we see here. And as I mentioned before, a lot of these miracle stories involve an icon, which is kind of the focal point of Mary's response to the healing miracle, or however she's intervening in the story. And almost always, if it is an icon that's being portrayed, the artist is showing her enthroned and seated, often underneath a canopy or an architectural framework, which kind of alludes perhaps to the frame of the icon, perhaps to its display in the church as well. On the other hand, if she's shown freestanding, as here, this is usually her apparition or her vision in a dream, but she's coming to the supplicant as herself rather than as an icon. But as we can see, in both cases, it really looks like she's there and she's interacting with the person. So if you didn't know any better, if you didn't know the story, you would think, well, this is just Mary and she's there and she's sitting down, but it's her. It's actually quite rare to find an image where Mary's icon is clearly shown as such. I pulled this one because it's like the exception that proves the rule, where we can see, okay, here's the frame of the icon. It's actually on an icon stand with a little brocade skirt. So this is an icon, but usually we just see Mary, and even in the same story later on, here she is, her icon in a church, but we can't tell. So as a rule, I think what's really important here is that Mary's presence is visually emphasized, whether the source of that presence is an icon or not. And this is showing us both the efficacy of icons as objects of devotion and the accessibility of Mary, who's quite ready and present to respond to her supplicants. Another feature of many of the paintings is a hierarchical scale, and this is where the most important figures are larger than the rest. This importance might be based on their sacred status, their social rank, or just their importance as protagonists of the narrative. And of course, Mary is often, though not always, the largest figure. There's also a convention for depicting villains of the story, which is to show them in profile. This relates to the concept of Buddha, or the evil eye, in Ethiopian culture, the idea that beings with demonic associations, sometimes even human beings, can inflict physical or spiritual harm on victims through the power of their gaze. So by showing an evil character in profile, with just the one eye visible, this was a way of symbolically impeding their power. Again, it's not an absolute rule, but by the 17th century, with this body of material, it's pretty much standard. And here, this is a really interesting example, because the villains in the story are this group of bandits who are preparing to attack a pious young man as he's traveling. However, this young man was in the habit of regularly praying to Mary's icon and crowning it with flowers every day. You see that here. So just when bandits are about to attack, they see this vision of Mary. She descends from heaven enthroned, and as the young man praises her, flowers start falling from his mouth. And this is, bandits are shocked by this. They interrogate the young man, what was that all about? And he tells them, well, I used to pray to this icon and I used to crown it. And so they're very moved. They abandon their evil ways and they end up dedicating themselves to becoming monks. So what we see here is them about to attack. They're shown in profile. And then down here, they've dropped their weapons. They're thinking better of it. They're shown in 3/4. And finally, they've become monks. And actually, this is a change of appearance that is symbolic. They've grown beards to indicate their new status. Other meaningful expressions and gestures that we can talk about. I actually would love to hear your thoughts on this, because this is something that scholars have just barely mentioned a few little things, but I think so many of these are culturally embedded. They're not necessarily accessible to a Western audience, but are part of Ethiopian and Eritrean culture. So one is the crossed arms that we see here, an indication of supplication or gratitude. We often find this pose in images of characters who are praying to Mary, as well as in the patron portraits that I mentioned before. Mary herself is often shown reaching towards someone with 2 fingers extended, as here. This is probably a modified version of the blessing gesture that was common in Greek Byzantine icons. And then a person resting their head on their hand, one eye is closed. An example like here is sleeping, another common sleeping pose, lying with 2 hands tucked into the lap, eyes closed. But then again, the closed eyes can indicate blindness depending on what the story calls for, and that would be this example of a little girl who's healed blindness by Mary. So those are just a couple of examples, things that you could think about, try to observe in the paintings and figure out what they might mean. Again, I would love to hear if anyone has more thoughts on that. And then one last intriguing aspect of the paintings I want to discuss is just the great variety of scenarios that we see. There's a whole range of characters from different social backgrounds and different situations. There are bishops, there are beggars, Muslims, Christians and Jews, monks, nuns, wealthy lay people, a whole menagerie of animals. And for all of this stuff, the artists would have been pulling from their own memories and what they could see around them, as well as the expectations and conventions that they had that were socially embedded. So this is really wonderful source material for understanding different aspects of daily life in the period when the paintings were made. And some features we can look for include different types of costume, weapons and tools, furniture items, activities. For example, this is the distribution of the Eucharist, a lovely image of that. However, we do have to think critically. Sometimes simplification or what the narrative calls for, just convention, can take precedence over accuracy. Mary's costume, for example, where she's always shown wearing this long red robe and this blue shawl. This is a very old Christian convention for the depiction of Mary, widespread outside of Ethiopia as well as within it. So we can't necessarily take this as, a statement on what a woman would have been wearing in the 17th century when the image was made. Another convention is the depiction of Muslims as here wearing turbans. And of course, this refers to a real fashion, but at the same time, it's not necessarily the only meaning that a turban could have in real life. And it's not even necessarily the case that Muslims and Christians would have always dressed differently day to day. I mean, I don't know about Ethiopia, but as a good comparative example, in medieval Spain, where of course Christians and Muslims were mingling, artists used a very similar convention. But in fact, we know that in daily life, these two groups were often indistinguishable, and authorities were trying to impose visual difference on them, and they kept trying, so it clearly wasn't working. And so we have to think about these kinds of problems in terms of, is the artist doing this just because it's simple and people understand it, or because they're representing something literal? And then a great example, here we have this fascinating painting of the Cannibal of Kemer that Dr. Belcher shared with us yesterday. So in the upper half, we see here he is gruesomely devouring all his family, friends, and servants. And then down here, we see him offering water to the leper. So I want you all to take a look at this guy and tell me if you think it reminds you of anything or what you think he's dressed as. Specifically the costume. Any thoughts? Yeah.
And to me, it was like a conquistador. Like when I first saw it, I actually thought of like some of the Aztec codex paintings of like showing this even like the piles of bodies.
Yeah.
And like kind of almost like temples in the back. Like that was the first thing I thought.
Yeah, that's a great guess. So this is a painting of King Philip II of Spain in the 16th century. And you can see this is the costume type that they're thinking of. And what's especially interesting is that by the time the painting was made, this wasn't the current fashion in Europe anymore. So they had images of the Portuguese back then when they came in and they tried to make us Catholic, and we hated all of that stuff so much and we kicked them out. But they remembered what that looked like. And when this artist in particular thought, I'm going to paint a really bad rich guy who's up to no good. Like this is what I'm going for. So I just love that. And I thought, that's fascinating to look at. And another great example of how artists are playing around with things. And it's not always what it seems, but it's so wonderful to dig into.
It's on the website too, and so you can go in and look at zoom in if you want to and see that he has very long eyelashes. What is an Italian? What does a European look like?
Well, yeah, wonderful. All right, well that's everything I have for now. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Wonderful, thank you.
Jeremy, may I ask, when you ask the Q&As, that you paraphrase some of the questions that come from the class so that the people online can kind of understand? Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and open up for some questions. So if you've got questions for Jenica about the art and paintings.
I just want to interrupt for 1 second and say that we are very fortunate to have the PEM technical lead here. You know it? He came. Yeah. A huge part of making the site what it is. So he has to slip out, but I just wanted to introduce you.
Beautiful work.
Yes. Questions?
And maybe the penultimate painting or somewhere near there, just before my brilliant sister's analogy. There's paintings of these people who have their hands like this
Yeah.
on that side. Is it that they're trying to put, when body language wise, people like this, they're like this, or kind of cramped, so
Yeah.
you're scared of something, or Mary, you think Mary's higher than you and maybe you've done something. Just like the white guy, the Philip II, whoever he was, his hand on his hip is opposite, like I'm conquering y'all. That position means I think I'm better than the rest of you. But this one is penitence, but how do you explain it in the piece? That
Yeah.
several people did say that.
Yeah, so the question was about the meaning of the crossed arms gesture that we see in a lot of the paintings. And I think this indicates maybe not penitence, but a kind of supplication or gratitude. Either asking for something or thanking for something. Yeah, that's how it's been interpreted.
Yeah, just a quick add-on to that. This is a practice that we still see in Ethiopia. For example, if I was to go and get a blessing from the priest, I would cross my arms to go there. You'd see this in during church service, during liturgy, when the Holy Communion is being offered. You see the kids often crossing their arms and going there. So this is still practice. So to the Ethiopian eye, it's like, oh yeah, sure, he's crossing. Of course, that's the way that you would like approach where it's get blessing and all.
Even the.
Oh, yeah. So even the garments that we wear in the church, which is a white cloth, we would cross it.
And you
and
change
it's
it from normal attire to cross
Yeah.
attire.
Yeah.
Very intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The crossing representing cross.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Which one is it your observation where Mary's always depicted, and maybe this is the how holy is always depicted larger, grander? Is that that your observation as well, or am I only seeing it where she's always bigger and everything's always tiny?
Yeah, she's almost always larger, not always, sometimes the figures are off the scale, but very common as a way of indicating her status. So she's the most important figure in that image. Yeah.
What's the point of the camels? Because I've been on a camel by the Red Sea, and the Red Sea is not red, by the way. The tsunami, I was there when that, what do you call this? The ones, the red storm, no, the Hamilton, the red storm. I actually go to places when they actually have like, I don't want to go to a volcano, but I've been at a Hamilton. And you just see the sand coming towards you, and it's red. And I was picking up shells in the sea. And everybody said, run inside. And I'm stubborn, I'm afraid. Why do I need to run inside? So, but the camels, I was about to fire them and make them redundant because I don't know what they were doing. They weren't carrying any produce, any product. So can you explain why the two camels were standing there, like not earning their living? What's going on?
I think the camels in that story are hopefully earning their living. It's a story about some Muslim traders who are traveling when they are also beset by a storm. And the two traders who pray to Mary are saved. The one who refuses.
Somebody stole the goods. I didn't see any goods or anything.
Yeah, so they then after they're saved, they do bring goods to the temple. That was a partial. Out of two scenes from that story, I picked one because I love the picture. Of
I was
camels.
gonna give them the
So,
thing.
thank you for asking.
I had a question. One of the things I noticed that as Mary was given the blessing, she always had the baby with her. I don't know if there was any significance with that or just something, I guess a mother always keeps their child close. I don't know. Was there any significance in that?
Yeah, so the reason why Mary's often shown with Jesus, I think, has to do again with like the iconic image of Mary. So if it's an icon that's being discussed in the story, even though it's shown as if Mary is really there, we understand it's an icon from the text. And so she's shown as the mother and child because that's what people would have seen when they went into a church to pray to an icon. And then when she's, walking around as an apparition, sometimes she has Jesus with her, sometimes not. Sometimes he's with the babysitter.
I like.
There's two questions on there. You might start with the second one.
I'm curious about Jesus in the paintings. He is both tiny compared to Mary and old looking compared to a baby. Is that the norm?
I would say it is a norm. Yes, it's pretty usual to see. I'm not sure why he's shown so tiny, except to show that he's young and maybe they exaggerated a little bit. And then the old looking, yes, it's kind of an old tradition going back to very early Christian iconography as a way of almost showing respect for Christ as God, to show him looking more mature than a normal human baby.
Weird question. I'd like to know if, given the possibilities of constructing other narratives based on this narrative that you address in your research, how can we understand the image of women in history crossed by this retelling with the centrality of this body that quotes gestates the sacred? How can we also understand the sacredness knowledge?
I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but I do think that if you look into Marian literature, and especially the Ethiopian tradition in particular, you'll find a lot of really fascinating material that has to do with Mary's role and the feminine aspects of her sacredness. As you said, that she gestates God himself in her body, that she's the divine mother. So how this will promote changes in contemporary times, I think that's a question we can all ponder and answer for ourselves.
Other questions both in the room or on the chat? Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny.
I've been so waiting for that presentation. Thank you. Is it possible that we can get even the written form of your presentation? That'd be very helpful. We can talk about it. Yes. And now it's lunchtime. But is there something? Oh, yeah, we're gonna take, can you help me with that?
Sure.
I'm just gonna help say what some of you people who are online are from.
So at the beginning, we asked people to type in where they are. Good morning, I am tuning in from Howard, okay, here with us. Can you pronounce this one?
It says that Khadija is from Algeria.
Okay.
Oh, wow. We have Emmanuel.
We have
Yeah.
Nigeria,
Yeah, Elora. Nigeria.
Boston, yes. Then we have Matt in Boston, Massachusetts. Then we have Benson in Kenya. And Maureen in Washington, DC. Karen Brown in Maryland. Northern Virginia, Aisha's there. North Dakota, Katrina. Also, we'd like to mention for those who are both online and in the room, we do have the resource folder that's up and that's on the website. I'm going to share that. Okay, so if you go to CfAS.howard.edu, That's /SIE 2024. For everybody who's in the room, that's written on the cover of the program. For everybody who's online, I will paste it into the chat in a moment. It is also the place for everybody registered. And if you scroll down right here, these buttons, you have the event program with agenda and you have the resource folder and also in-person participant bios. So I will paste this into the chat. And we will go on lunch break and be back at. No, that's.
What does the program say?
12:45.
12:45.
But we'll have our scholars will have a joint family. We're looking for, and quite an exciting afternoon.
Great.